Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to wait to give some people a little bit more time to enter. Thanks for your patience. Just a few housekeeping rules. The Q&A is going to be disabled. We're excited to have this conversation. And another reminder that the chat is also going to be closed for now. You can drop your questions in the Q&A once that opens up, and we will be selecting the questions and answering them at the very end. The panelists are going to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started in a couple of minutes. The continuing legal education program and the CLE code will be offered twice throughout the presentation. We're going to share that in the chat when that time comes. And the CLA form you'll need will also be in the chat. So like we said, just give it a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hands and I'll see it. The host will see it. But again, the chat's going to be disabled for now, and the Q&A will be disabled for now.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a very full training ahead of us, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the folks who are here. I'm sure we'll be welcoming others as they trickle in. My name is Ann Matheson. I'm the co-director of the Empower Center, which is a collaboration with Sanctuary for Families and Health Hospitals. I am staff with Sanctuary for Families, so this presentation is a reflection of my work with Sanctuary for Families, and it is not a reflection of Health and Hospitals position on anything. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to my two colleagues and allow them to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Mitha Chowdhury, and I work with Anne at the Empower Center. I'm the program coordinator. Welcome everyone.
Hi, everybody. My name is Taina. I'm with the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for joining us.
So we are going to start off, as I think everyone knows, this is a presentation about global prostitution policy models. We're going to go ahead, advance to the next slide. We are focusing on the three primary legislative responses to the social issue of prostitution in operation around the world. Today, we're going to discuss each of these responses. The first section, we will briefly review criminalization. In the second section, we will review legalization and full decriminalization. Though there are nominal differences between full decriminalization and legalization, we will note those differences. They are largely the same in implementation and in effect, so they are reviewed simultaneously. And in the third section, we will analyze the equality model. So I am not going to explain each of these models in depth right now, because as we move throughout the presentation, we will take time to really examine each model and to provide case examples of each model in operation around the world. I'm going to turn it over now to Mitha.
So as Anne mentioned, we're just going to give a brief overview of what criminalization is. So criminalization, it treats prostitution as a matter of law and order and an issue of morality. So when prostitution is fully criminalized, we're talking about brothel keeping, promoting, which is also known as pimping, the purchase of sexual acts, and patronizing, which are all technically illegal. So the criminalization of sexually exploited women in the US reinforces an age-old culture of victim blaming. Criminalization, it perpetuates a vision of prostitution as a victimless crime committed by immoral sexual deviants. And in those US states where sex buyers also face legal sanctions, we find that laws remain largely unenforced. And so across the US, sex buyers act with near impunity, and they largely escape legal punishment, even though they're the driving economic force behind prostitution. We see that national studies indicate that only 10 to 30% of all prostitution arrests are of sex buyers, while 70 to 90% of arrests target those who are commercially sexually exploited. Law enforcement officers often collaborate in this exploitation as well. So there's a study by Raphael and Shapiro of women in prostitution in Chicago, which found that 24% of women on the streets who had been raped identified a police officer as the perpetrator. And then criminal records and repeat incarceration, it creates severe economic disadvantages for survivors of the sex trade, and it adds to the difficulty for women exiting the sex trade. Criminal records from prostitution-related crimes and time spent incarcerated limit a survivor's ability to access education, legal employment, and loans. And so I'm going to hand it over to Anne to give a description of what legalization and full decriminalization is.
Thank you, Mitha. Legalization, as I was saying at the beginning, is nearly identical to full decriminalization in theory, practice, and consequences. So I discussed these policy models simultaneously. Legalization and full decriminalization have flourished alongside the economic model of neoliberalism. This policy model frames prostitution in terms of personal choice, individual freedom, and market contracts made between rational, consenting adults with equal power. Under legalization, the state recognizes prostitution as lawful. In legalization regimes, the government takes an active role in regulating prostitution by licensing brothels, limiting the number of women in brothels, or requiring the registration of individuals with local authorities. So after legalizing prostitution, municipal and national governments may also promote the sex trade, which is seen in the Netherlands, happening in the Netherlands. Full decriminalization, on the other hand, eliminates laws and penalties associated with all of the sex trade. Enforcement of prostitution-related laws is transferred from law enforcement to local city councils. And these local councils dedicate funding and administrative staff to regulate the trade. Local councils often undertake this task without authority or resources to investigate, penalize, or shut down brothels or pimps. In a full decrim regime, the sex trade, which is a trade characterized by violence and abuse, is supposed to self-regulate to prevent that violence and abuse. The country that decriminalizes the sex trade benefits from sex trade tourism and often collects tax revenue. There is no decriminalization regime in the world that doesn't include a legalization on the municipal level. Decriminalization simply refers to removing criminal prohibitions for all or most aspects of prostitution from the penal code. Once decriminalized, local implementation of the sex trade always requires some sort of municipal regulation, because the sex trade is subject to the exact same regulations as are other legal businesses. Countries that legalize or completely decriminalize prostitution encourage growth of the sex trade. We're going to look at the next slide. Now I'm going to discuss how legalization has played out in some specific locations. So in the Netherlands, prior to the year 2000, pimping and brothel keeping were criminalized. These laws were largely unenforced. In an effort to mitigate exploitation and to benefit from the large, illegal, but lucrative commercial sex trade, the Dutch government began considering legalizing and taxing prostitution. The state provided subsidies to NGOs lobbying for legalization. With government funding, groups advocated internationally to create a theoretical division of prostitution into two categories: forced, currently known as sex trafficking, and voluntary, wherein individuals in the sex trade were reclassified as sex workers who were presumed to be there out of choice. Lobby groups and the government that funded them divided prostitution into these two categories in order to legally tax one, the legal voluntary category, and to excise the other, the illegal forced category. After legitimizing a sector of the illegal sex trade as consensual and hence ethical, it was much easier to argue for legalization as the Dutch official position on prostitution. Sex buyers formed organizations to promote buying and legalization and were drawn in as advisors on governmental reports regarding prostitution. In 2000, their lobby efforts were successful. Pimping, brothel keeping, sex buying, and the sale of sexual acts were fully legalized in the Netherlands. By shifting the framework of prostitution from that of economic and sexual exploitation to one of labor, the harms and violence of prostitution are concealed beneath the sanitized language of sex work. Next slide, please. After passing this law, the Netherlands began to face major issues. In 2003, the city of Amsterdam closed many sex bars and clubs and curbed all-night brothel hours. The street tolerance zone was prohibited completely. In 2005 and 2006, because of the proliferation of organized crime controlling the sex trade, many Dutch cities closed their legal prostitution zones because they had become so unsafe, not only for the people in brothels, but also for general citizens. In 2006, 37 brothels in Amsterdam were closed because the city council determined that they were run by organized crime. Men were facilitating human and drug trafficking out of the legal venues. In 2006, Europol investigations revealed that Dutch pimps and brothel owners were collaborating with traffickers to bring women into the country, and that many women in the legal sex trade were being subject to extreme violence, up to and including murder. In 2008, Amsterdam City Council introduced measures to cut the red light district's sex windows by nearly half, from 482 to 243. And I just want folks to take a second to think about those numbers. So in a legalized regime, in just the city of Amsterdam, they had 482 legal brothels at one point in time, and then it was reduced to 243, which is still a pretty astounding number. Next slide, please. In 2008, the National Prosecutor's Office commissioned the National Police Service to investigate the status of prostitution in the Netherlands. The report, entitled Beneath the Surface, which anyone can access, and if you can't find it, you're welcome to email me. I can drop my email in the chat. This report documented that criminal gangs working as pimps and bodyguards had been using extreme violence against women in the legal, licensed, supposedly protected legal sector of the sex trade for years. This 2008 report had asked, how is it possible that sex trafficking was able to take place almost unimpeded in the licensed window prostitution sector? And they identified several answers to this question. The first is that law enforcement has less power and incentive to investigate prostitution activities, since those activities law enforcement is less critical of activities that are legal. The second answer they identified is that the legal commercial sex trade acts as a cover for the illicit trade, making it harder to track the illegal market. The third is that brothel inspections were not successful in detecting exploitation. They found that the women in the brothels were often monitored by pimps and the brothel owners while they were while they were being interviewed by inspectors. And those, the pimps or the brothel owners may have been present, or they may have been on site, or they may have just been outside. But regardless, they found that presence really impacted the person's ability to reveal the true conditions under which they were being exploited. The fourth is that the bodyguards were often working for criminal gangs. So these were supposed to be bodyguards of the women in the brothels or in the window sector, but they found that those bodyguards were actually oftentimes pimps, or they were employed by the pimps, and so they were not actually protecting the women. They were ensuring that the women were kept, in the brothels and were seeing a certain number of buyers that were a quota that was set by the pimps. So these bodyguards in the Netherlands are a public presence, and the report found that those bodyguards, they documented that the bodyguards were maintaining contact with the police, which the investigators suggested increased the risk of the law enforcement officers colluding with those exploiters. The fifth reason that they found is that legalization relies largely on the goodwill of brothel owners and sex buyers, who are often exploiters themselves, to prioritize reporting abuse over profit margins and personal sexual satisfaction. The investigators found that one criminal gang had forced women to work in the window brothels for years without detection by inspectors. So the conclusion was that licensing and inspecting a brothel gives no guarantee that the women, the trans women within that brothel who are being sold, are not going to be abused. Sex buyers and brothel operators do not report the abuse that they witness, and women are often under extreme duress, facing violence and threats of violence by pimps. I'm now going to turn it over to Mitha to look at another case study.
Thank you. So in 2003, New Zealand fully decriminalized sex buying, pimping, and selling. And a 2005 follow-up report revealed that the number of unregulated brothels had increased, and that there were significantly high reported incidents of violence, which included murder against exploited women. Rather than reducing the number of children exploited in the sex trade, the New Zealand Commissioner for Children, Dr. Cindy Cairo, stated that New Zealand had a clear problem of child sexual exploitation, which most likely worsened since the decriminalization of prostitution. Inspector Gary Knowles of Christchurch stated that there had been a noticeable rise in the number of exploited children since the introduction of the new legislation. Reports indicated that girls as young as 12 were identified on the streets, and they were sought mostly by men who wanted unprotected sex. Police in Wellington report that since full decriminalization was enacted, the average age of people sold is younger. And in 2004, the US International Trafficking in Persons report identified New Zealand as a destination country for human trafficking. And despite this, it took the country 12 years to convict a single trafficker. And this is because the full decriminalization laws, it thwarts the ability of law enforcement to investigate and prosecute sex trafficking. In 2004, the Trafficking in Persons report also indicated that New Zealand faces a large problem of children being internally trafficked for the purposes of sex trafficking. And the report identified Pacific Island and Maori youth in particularly were at risk of sex trafficking. So there's this lack of cohesion between the government and its agencies about how to handle or investigate these cases. And it meant that no one was willing to admit that sex trafficking was occurring in New Zealand. So there's a lack of official action over human trafficking in New Zealand, and this reluctance to acknowledge its existence, which stretches back 3 decades. And it took nearly 6,000 hours of labor, multiple trips to Fiji, and a complex analysis of information from cell phone transmitter towers to gather enough evidence to launch a prosecution against the first man convicted of sex trafficking in New Zealand. So this conviction, it came 12 years after the country was identified as a destination country for human trafficking. And I'm just going to pass it over to Taina to do some comparisons between New Zealand and Germany.
So Anne spoke about the Netherlands and Mitha spoke about New Zealand. We have not yet spoken about Germany, which legalized prostitution in 2002. The laws governing both Germany and New Zealand are often portrayed as being markedly different from each other. So last year, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women produced this report that looks at these two models, Germany and New Zealand. So Germany is known as the legalized model, and New Zealand is known as the decriminalized model. And what we found is that the two models, the elements of the two models are so, the differences are so minimal, and neither national legislation achieves its stated goals. So here, obviously the populations are radically different from people in prostitution in Germany are 64,000 to 250,000. In New Zealand, it's much smaller. There are more sheep than human beings in New Zealand. But as you will see from the checks, is that the population in prostitution does not vary in both countries. If you look at the legalized brothels, the majority of the people in those brothels come from other countries. And then for every legal brothel, you will have 4 to 5 illegal brothels. So in Germany, the majority of people who are in these brothels, unfortunately, the government doesn't have specific percentages. They say anywhere between 10% and 95% come from the poorest countries of Eastern Europe, from the global South, including Nigeria. And in New Zealand, the population is mostly either indigenous, Pacific Islanders, Maori, or from Asia. Next. Let's see. Okay, so again, how many sex buyers are there in the world? I suppose the good news is that worldwide, there are only about 10 to 20% of the male population that are sex buyers, but 99.9% of sex buyers are male, and that is across the board. In New Zealand, there's no government data available. I think that is one of the major consequences of having a decriminalized regime, is that the government does not feel it has any obligation to record any elements of the sex trade, including the number of people in the sex trade, the number of brothels that are around. As Anne mentioned, the responsibility falls on the local councils, the municipal governments to collect that kind of data, which is often extremely difficult to do because of limited funds and other resources. But as you will see, and also we put a sex buyers report, which I will talk about a little later. Once it is fully decriminalized or fully legalized, the additional element to sex buying is that the government basically gives a green light to men in particular that sexual acts are for sale, and that male sexual entitlement is a sport like any other sport. Yes, you can go to the next one. Okay. So model comparison continues with Australia. So Australia legalized the system of prostitution in 1994, known as the Prostitution Control Act. And again, like the other countries that we have highlighted, they had very specific goals. One, to bring prostitution above ground, meaning to make it safer. They also wanted to eliminate child sex trafficking. They wanted to allow the people in prostitution, who are overwhelmingly women, to go to the police or go to medical centers should they need the assistance, and all of that failed. So last year, the state of Victoria recognized that prostitution was a center of extreme violence, of persistent discrimination. The stigma was not removed, which is another myth, that legalization or decriminalization removes the stigma of prostituted people, and that the Prostitution Control Act was an abject failure. Sadly, what happened was that the government has now is in the process of decriminalizing fully as a consequence of the failure of legalization. So here and it may be confusing to again see like how can one state go from legalization to decriminalization. So basically what the state of Victoria is saying is that we can no longer control the violence and the trafficking that is occurring in the legalized brothels, and it is therefore unfair for the extended population that is prostituted outside of the legal brothels to seek protection, and therefore we will fully decriminalize the entire system. The decriminalization efforts were led by Fiona Patton, MP, a member of parliament, whose partner, Robbie Swan, is a well-known pornographer and owns one of the largest pornography sites, Eros. Okay, next slide, please. So if anyone looks at the legislative histories of the penal codes that govern prostitution, whether it is in Canada, Australia, South Africa, even some parts of Europe, one can see that it is directly linked to the colonialist history. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in particular, Hawaii as well, and many other countries in the Pacific, either Pacific Islands or New Zealand, it specifically says that prostitution or the system of prostitution was brought to the shores with the European settlers. And if you speak to many Indigenous people, even in this country, whether they're Indigenous from Canada, the United States, Australia, Hawaii, they often cannot find either the concept or the word for prostitution. And so the sexual exploitation, rape, and torture of Indigenous women was widespread, not just in Australia, but in every country that has been colonized. And so, and this happened here in the United States and in the Caribbean and Latin America as well, is that when the Aboriginal and Indigenous women could no longer satisfy the demand for the colonists, then what happens is they import women from other countries. In the United States, that was from Africa, and around the world, it was from other countries, particularly in Australia, it was primarily from countries in Asia. And so as a result today, over 90% of the women in prostitution establishments across Australia comes from China, Thailand, Korea, and other countries in the Pacific Islands. Again, as my colleagues have mentioned, for every registered brothel, there are usually 5 to 10 more unlicensed brothels, and that is the case for any prostitution market around the world. Next. Just one point before. So in most countries around the world, prostitution is governed at the federal level, meaning that the central government governs prostitution. In Australia and the United States, prostitution is governed at a state level, Switzerland as well. They are federal countries, and so each state can decide how it wants to regulate prostitution. In countries where you do have the federalization of prostitution, then the responsibility is borne on, again, local councils and municipal councils.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
So you'll see here on this slide a few statistics about sex buyers. So I'll highlight like a couple here that have been posted. So nearly half of buyers have paid for sexual acts with women they knew to be under the control of a pimp or a trafficker. And prostitution is the only crime in the US where the victims are more likely to be prosecuted than the perpetrators. And so these stats, they're really highlighting a component of this social issue that's often missing in the media, in research, and that is the integral role played by sex buyers in sustaining the sex trade. So the buyers of commercial sex who victimize women and youth, they're nearly exclusively men, as Taina mentioned. Society, they're not inclined to research, discuss, or hold buyers accountable. And so what this causes is a gap in research regarding which interventions best deter sex buyers from buying. So ultimately, prostitution is the consequence of boys and young men who have been socialized into a culture of toxic masculinity. And in this culture, sex is not based on mutuality or reciprocity, but rather it's based on unequal power and control, where one person's pleasure can be met at the expense of another person's well-being, their physical and their psychological health as well. Buying sexual access to another person's body creates a sense of power in buying. Buyers often believe it's their right to do whatever they want with the person that they've purchased. Many buyers, they seek power and sexual satisfaction by demanding particularly violent and degrading sex acts, and also demanding access to a variety of women, including in age, racialized identity, and body type. So what this does is practice, it mimics the American economic model of capitalism, but in this case, the products are human beings. And so we find that there's this unreal shame and stigma that's hoisted onto survivors, but buyers have none of this burden. In actual fact, many buyers, they use buying to reinforce their masculine power and their position in society. Buyers, they often build camaraderie with one another on message boards, through sex parties, and even in corporate boardrooms where buying women is a normal part of the culture. Buyers, they're typically respected members of the community with jobs, wives, children. They're from every profession, every socioeconomic strata, and they're usually folks with disposable income and in many cases with social power. And frankly, they're the opposite of those who are exploited. And so we're seeing here, despite the havoc that it wreaks on many women's lives, sex buying in the US, it's normalized in our culture by pornography, mainstream media, strip clubs, corporate cultures that integrate sex buying into business deals and building camaraderie among male employees. And so I wanted to move on to discuss some myths about full decrim and legalization that we often hear. The first one is that that full decriminalization and legalization make prostitution safer. And so I just wanted to discuss a few studies that prove that that's false. We even see here, there's a quote from the former mayor of Amsterdam, where we know prostitution is legalized. Job Cohen, he states that it appeared impossible to create a safe and controllable zone for women that was not open to abuse by organized crime. So in 2017, there's a study that was released in the United Kingdom where prostitution is also legalized. And the study revealed that more than 3/4 of the 65 legal brothels in the study were linked to criminal gangs. The study found that the movements of 1/3 of the women were controlled, and almost 50% of the women were identified as Romanian immigrants. The report states, despite multiple visits to commercial brothels, there was little appetite for enforcement against these establishments as long as the level of harm, perceived harm, remained low. So police, they were very keen in ensuring that no establishments employed people under the age of 18. But beyond this, it was difficult to assess whether other harms were taking place because people in the sex trade were generally reluctant to provide any information. And they offered what appeared to be well-rehearsed scripts in response to questions from the police. So there was one Romanian prostituted person was heard to say to a new arrival when questioned by the police, "You know what you have to say." And so if we advance to the next slide, there's a quote here that I wanted to highlight from a New York City survivor. "My body can't take it. My body can't take so many men." So Not only does full decrim and legalization make prostitution less safe due to an increase in organized crime, but it also fails to acknowledge the medical and psychological impact of repeatedly selling your body to strangers for sex and what that means for survivors in the sex trade. So from my work at the Empower Center, I can tell you victims often present with numerous medical conditions, some of which have been highlighted here on the slide. So there's like malnourishment, broken bones, burns, stab wounds, head injuries, hip, neck, jaw pain, STIs. We have reproductive issues. And these are just a few examples of some of the potential internal and external injuries that survivors are living with. Many survivors, they're left physically or developmentally disabled. And according to one estimate, a third of survivors, they're disabled from the emotional trauma and physical injuries, including brain injury, which is suffered in the sex trade. Many survivors, they have been brought to informal settings by an exploiter to treat their injuries. And so their chronic pain may or may not have been treated under the table. We see that many have dental trauma and neglect from using substances to cope whilst in their life. And many women in the sex trade have had pregnancies that they've either been forced to carry or abort. Forced births and abortions, it can complicate pregnancy later in life, and many don't report that their abortions or births were forced, which is really important information to know. And then lastly, like many patients, they have no apparent injuries, but when they start speaking with our obstetrician, they begin to verbalize a number of concerns that they've been dealing with for a very long time. And they often don't realize that these issues merit attention because they've gone on for so long without any care, and this is normal to them. Again, if we could advance to the next slide. So here's another quote from a survivor. At first, it made me feel degraded, but now I just switch off, pretend I am not there. So this quote demonstrates disassociation. And so when it comes to the psychological impact, the trauma victims and survivors experience, it's incomprehensible. Survivors struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, depression. Many struggle to remember details of their life because of memory damage or blocked traumatic memories or dissociation. Survivors, they are documented of having high rates of psychiatric disorders. Again, there's a list here of, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, self-injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, and dissociative disorders. Dissociation is a particularly severe trauma-related symptom and is common amongst survivors of the sex trade. And it develops in response to extreme pain and fear. It serves as a coping strategy for enduring extremely painful, frightening, or potentially deadly life events, which is something that survivors in the sex trade experience daily. So trauma endured in prostitution, it induces heightened emotional reactions, such as terror, surprise, shame, helplessness, feeling trapped or exposed. And what this does, it catalyzes a dissociative state. And so what we're seeing is these mental health struggles arise because of the trauma and the violence that's inherent to the commercial sex trade. So the medical and the psychological impacts that we've discussed here, they're often lifelong and carry on even after someone may leave the sex trade. And so the sex trade, it can't be made less harmful, or these effects can't be regulated or deregulated away under legalization or full decriminalization regimes. So next is another myth that's often said about full decriminalization and legalization. And this is one that we commonly hear, is that it reduces human trafficking. So I'm going to discuss a few examples to show you why this isn't the case. In Germany, where the sex trade is legalized, studies indicate that 65 to 80% of women and girls sold in the sex trade are immigrant women, the majority from Romania and Bulgaria. A few years ago, Germany's brothel king, Jürgen Rudloff, who's an owner of a major brothel chain, including the infamous Stuttgart brothel Paradise, was convicted of aiding and abetting criminal gangs as they trafficked women into his legal brothels. So he was unable to meet the demand from sex buyers for paid sexual acts. So he allowed pimps to use violence to force women into and keep them into his brothels. 5 years after Germany's law changed, a family ministry report evaluating the effects of the law found that the objectives were partially achieved, and that deregulation had not brought about any measurable actual improvement in the social coverage for those in the sex trade. They found that, quote, neither working conditions nor the ability to exit the profession has improved. There is no solid proof today that the law has reduced crime, end quote. In a German poll, a brothel operator was quoted as saying that she valued the prostitution law because it reduced the likelihood of raids. So she found that the law was actually more advantageous for brothel operators than people in prostitution. So in Germany, it's known that food vendors face more regulation than brothel operators, which is highlighting exactly how legalizing prostitution has failed. In Berlin, one survivor named Alina describes how sex buyers took drugs to prolong sexual performance and could last all night. Quote, a line often formed outside Alina's room. She says she eventually stopped counting how many men got into her bed. I blocked it out, she says. There were so many every day. The pimps were prepared for raids, and they used to boast that they knew the police officers. They knew when a raid was about to happen, stated Alina, which is why she never dared confide in a police officer, end quote. And then the last example that I just want to highlight, a trafficking survivor in Germany stated that she received the men in her room for up to 18 hours a day. She says the police officers also came to the brothel as customers. Quote, they didn't notice anything or else they didn't care, end quote. So what we're seeing here is the argument that legalization and full decriminalization will curtail sex trafficking, but it's disproved by the economic principles that decriminalization or legalization results in more brothels. More brothels require more people to fill them. Immigrant, undocumented women and girls are trafficked from the poorest nations to meet the affluent countries' demand for paid sex. And so this is demonstrated by that case mentioned earlier of Jürgen Rudloff, the owner of the major brothel, who was convicted of abetting criminal gangs that were trafficking women into his illegal brothels. So as Rudolph's brothels expanded under legalization, he couldn't fill his brothels with enough women legally. And then the very last myth that we often hear is full decrim or legalization, it reduces child exploitation. So there's this false distinction between adults and children in prostitution. It ignores that the majority of survivors enter the sex trade as children and teens. Traffickers and pimps, they recruit youth into prostitution to meet the demand for younger looking, vulnerable girls and boys. So what you actually see is children and youth are aging into adults in the sex trade. The Netherlands, they raised the age of legal entry into prostitution from 18 to 21 because of the extensive exploitation of youth within the sex trade. And in 2006, the Dutch National Reporter on Human Trafficking stated that there was a striking increase in the number of registered underage victims, particularly in the age group of 15 to 17 years. Interpol and Dutch police statements reveal that the Netherlands play a leading role in creating and sustaining pedophilic networks in Europe. And so I'm going to pass it over to Anne to talk a bit about language.
Thank you, Mitha. So current prostitution discourse now automatically divides our thinking into two categories. One category, the category of good, consensual sex work, and then the other category is bad, forced sex trafficking. And this discourse treats these two categories as if they were not intricately linked in a cycle of supply and demand. The language that we now use to talk about this social issue has shifted very dramatically in the last 30 years. What we see very prominently now is the language of sex work, which has arisen, and that particular language hides exploitation that is inherent to the sex trade. Prostitution beneath that language becomes conceptually just another form of work integrated into the language of labor. Referring to sex buyers as customers, which happens underneath that framework, legitimizes demand, it legitimizes privilege, and it erases the power imbalance between the buyer and the person that he is buying. It also supposes that the person being purchased and the person who is purchasing are equal parties in a business transaction. Referring to pimps as managers implies that there's a non-exploitative mentoring work relationship between a pimp, a brothel owner, a trafficker, and the person being sold in the sex trade. So anyone who is a survivor, anyone who works in this field knows that this language is very misleading. Calling sexual violence an occupational hazard, which is what happens in countries that have fully decriminalized or legalized the sex trade, removes the people who perpetrate the violence from the conversation. And this language implies that male violence, which is taking place routinely in the sex trade, is actually just a normal risk of employment. There's a neurolinguistic shift, which is reframing sex trafficking as, quote, migration for sex work. This language eliminates the coercive nature of trafficking, and it eliminates the trafficker completely. The trafficker is removed from the conversation. So without a trafficker, all of a sudden, women and even children who are being trafficked, they're now viewed as empowered agents who are just crossing international borders out of shrewd entrepreneurialism. As this language shifts, we see that conceptual category of forced prostitution slowly shrinking, while the category of the empowered sex worker expands. And this shift allows wealthy countries to outsource their growing demand for women, trans folks, and children to poorer countries to fill their red light districts and their flat rate brothels. The powerful actors, governments, prostitution buyers, pimps, traffickers, they are removed from the dialogue because of this language shift and this language sanitation. Next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Taina.
So this is just a recap of what was said until now, that in terms of model comparison, neither framework, whether legalization or full decriminalization, has achieved the stated goals of the governments that have enacted such laws. It has not offered people in prostitution more autonomy. It has not improved their labor conditions. It has not reduced the stigma. It has not reduced the violence that they face at the hands of sex buyers, pimps, brothel owners, or because of prostitution itself. It has not reduced criminal activity. And it certainly has not curbed child sex trafficking. And there's another element, is that in these countries where, well, although the United States is a major producer of pornography, the Netherlands, Germany, and other legalized and decriminalized environments are also among the highest producers of pornography. In both frameworks, in each of these countries, there is a reported increased number of sex trafficking, and also a removal of the tools that can detect and identify and prosecute traffickers. And next slide goes to Anne.
So this concludes the first two sections of our presentation, where we focused briefly on criminalization, and then we dove in depth analyzing full decrim and legalization. These are some of the very, we know that we've provided you with a significant amount of information. So these are some of the key takeaways we would like for folks to have. We would like you to understand that under criminalization, there are unfair arrests happening and incarceration of people who are bought and sold in the sex trade. There is an extremely discriminatory impact. Largely, people who are being arrested are women of color. So we would like folks, if you walk away with nothing else, we'd like you to walk away with that understanding of criminalization. We also know that the arrests are overwhelmingly of the person of survivors of prostituted individuals, and that sex buyers and traffickers and pimps are largely not arrested or not prosecuted under a criminalization regime. The second point that we want you to walk away with is understanding that full decriminalization and legalization, they increase sex buying. They normalize the social practice of sex buying, which is a very harmful social practice, which has medical and psychological impacts on the people who are bought in the sex trade. And that normalization, that leads to an increase in the size of the sex trade itself. And that means that third-party profiteers step in, so pimps and traffickers, brothel owners, massage parlor owners who are selling sex out of the massage parlors, they step in to recruit, manipulate, coerce, force people from the most marginalized social groups into the sex trade in order to meet that growing demand. So what we see is that with an increase, with a legalization or full decriminalization of sex buying, it inevitably, in every country where this model has been implemented, it inevitably leads to a dramatic increase in sex trafficking. So the conclusion for us is that purchasing sexual acts is a harmful cultural practice that hopefully, societally we can work toward ending. I am going to announce the CLE code for those of you who are seeking CLE credit now. We're also going to drop in the chat the form, the certificate that you will need to complete this request. So the code is 34 ERSW. We're going to make announcement for the codes one more time in this presentation, but again, I'm going to repeat myself. The code is 34 ERSW, and the letters are all caps. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So the equality model. So we heard about decriminalization and full decriminalization and legalization. There is a third way. And the equality model it was also known in 1999 for 10 years as the Swedish model, then the Nordic model. Some countries call it the abolitionist model. In Africa, they are now calling it the Sankara model after Thomas Sankara. For purposes of this talk, and I think more globally now, it is known as the equality model, which is a legal framework that is based on principles of human rights, equality, and feminism, and basically has four major points. It decriminalizes the individuals who are engaged in prostitution. It criminalizes sex buying, pimping, and brothel keeping, and other forms of commercial sexual establishments, or such as sex tour operators or escorting. It offers comprehensive services to the people bought and sold in prostitution. It also offers exit strategies for people who are ready to leave the sex trade. And from a cultural perspective, it develops educational campaigns to help our lawmakers, policymakers, and especially our communities in recognizing that prostitution is a form of gender-based violence and discrimination and not an exception to it. Next slide, please. So when we talk about human rights, it's important to take a bird's eye view and go back to 1948, right after the Second World War, when member states came together with this new entity called the United Nations and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the architect of which was New Yorker Eleanor Roosevelt. And I recommend that everyone read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because it's an aspirational document that every single government has agreed to examine and incorporate in their national laws. The main elements of the declaration for our purposes here is the recognition of the inherent dignity of a human being, and that by virtue of one's birth, that everyone has a right to such dignity, to equality, and that such rights are inalienable, universal, and particular. The dignity and worth of the human person is also a human rights concept that we see throughout international conventions. Whether it's the convention, here is the 1949 Convention for the Suppression of Traffic in Persons and the Exploitation of Prostitution of Others, which led to the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, also known as the Palermo Protocol or the UN Trafficking Protocol. Again, talks very explicitly about the dignity and worth of the human being, which are also featured in other international covenants, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, which the United States did not ratify. It is also mentioned in the Convention for the Protection of the Rights of the Child, which again, the United States did not ratify. Very often the United States is not always an abiding member of the international community. However, the United States did ratify the Palermo Protocol, which gives us the internationally recognized definition of human trafficking. It establishes that consent to exploitation is irrelevant, which is also a concept that you find in other human rights situations where one's rights have been violated. Under Article 9.5 of the Palermo Protocol, governments are mandated to target the demand that fosters trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation and also for labor trafficking. And it guides governments in providing assistance and protection to victims. One important aspect in the definition of the Palermo Protocol is that movement is not required. Many times people still believe that in order to prove trafficking, you need to prove cross-border or some type of travel. That is not true. One could never leave her neighborhood or even her building and be a victim of trafficking. And similarly, a trafficker is anyone who procures, entices, coerces, abuses someone. The major elements of the means of trafficking, there are many, but the two key ones are abuse of power and abuse of vulnerability. Next slide, please. So the US federal law recognizes that sex buyers are part of the chain of sex trafficking. What does that mean? So the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA, which was enacted in 2000, and there are many reauthorizations thereafter, has a bifurcated definition of trafficking and in particular sex trafficking. So the definition that most people are aware of is the severe forms of trafficking, the criminal provision of the TVPA, which requires for a prosecutor to prove that a trafficker forced or coerced or frauded an individual to be found to guilty of trafficking. As we know from our work, that proving force in a situation of trafficking is extremely difficult. It's a very, very high burden of proof, and which could explain why the prosecutions of traffickers remain extremely low in this country and in many other countries. However, there is the actual definition of sex trafficking, which resembles more or less, or tracks, I should say, the Palermo Protocol. The TVPA still does not meet the standards of the Palermo Protocol. This is a work in progress, but you will see that the definition of sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, and emphasis I added, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And that means that the US government recognizes that in cases of trafficking, a sex buyer is as culpable as a trafficker. Next. It's also important to note that the National Security Presidential Directive number 22 states that the US government recognizes that the sex trade is linked to sex trafficking. So very often we hear that there are two different entities. There are people who are in prostitution voluntarily, and then there is sex trafficking, and never the two shall meet. It's important to note that trafficking is a very complex crime, but it is just a vehicle through which a trafficker or an exploiter or a pimp brings their victim to an end destination. In labor trafficking, that end destination can be agricultural settings, a restaurant, a nail salon, factory. In sex trafficking, that end destination is the sex trade. And by sex trade, we mean the entire system of commercial sexual exploitation that includes prostitution, pornography, escorting, online sugar dating, illicit massage parlors. The list is long. And so here it's important that not only does the US government officially oppose prostitution and states that it does not recognize it as a form of labor, but it also recognizes that it contributes to the phenomenon of trafficking in persons. So while not everyone who is in the sex trade were trafficked, the vast majority, probably in the high 90s, of people who are in the sex trade were trafficked. It's also important to note that the majority of people who find themselves in the sex trade, who are bought and sold in the sex trade, were sex trafficked as children. And therefore, the difference between a sex trafficked child of 17 and a so-called consensual adult in the sex trade at 18 is 60 seconds. There is not a legal status that disappears on one's 18th birthday. Next slide, please. In last year, the US Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which is part of the US State Department, also issued a report that was drafted by sex trade survivors and sex trafficking survivors, which links sex trafficking with prostitution and specifically calls on the US government to develop anti-demand initiatives, and also condemns the terminology and ideology of prostitution as labor, which we know is a concept that was invented and created by the sex trade itself in the late 70s, early 1980s in the United States, and then subsequently supported by the Dutch government in particular. Next slide, please. I believe this is Anne's turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Taina. In 1999, Sweden passed the Peace for Women Act. And with this act, Sweden criminalized sex buying, pimping, and decriminalized people who are bought and sold in the sex trade. So Sweden was the very first country to recognize that prostitution is neither work nor a victimless crime, but is rather a severe form of violence against women and marginalized communities. Iceland, Norway soon adopted the same legislation. Every year, these countries are ranked among the top 5 of the World Economic Forum's Index for Equality between Women and Men. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. Each of these countries has made the equality model legislation a part of their gender equality policies. The equality model is a collaborative effort focused on changing social norms that enable the sex trade to flourish. This includes a commitment to eradicating poverty, increasing employment access for marginalized communities, and strengthening policies such as their generous parental leave policies, as well as universal childcare. In accordance with the social democratic drive to agitate for improvements in social change and social coverage, the primary intention of the equality model, it's not punitive. It is specifically intended to change social norms that promote and enable prostitution to flourish. The 6 primary directives of the equality model are listed on this slide. The model is a combination of three equally important components. The first is changing norms about the sex trade through community education. The second is the provision of social services, so free social services to people who are in the sex trade. And the third is enforcing laws prohibiting sex buying, pimping, and trafficking. Next slide. The equality model was the result of 20 years of dialogue within Sweden. It was a very long process before this law was implemented. There was a point in time before 1999 that more and more information was emerging about how prostitution, how the sex trade in particular is characterized by the abuse of power and violence. So a lot of people were starting to see that folks who were in the sex trade were emerging with the severe medical, psychological impacts that Mitha noted earlier. In January of 1999, when Sweden criminalized patronizing, promoting, and brothel owning, this particular point in time in Sweden, they had shifted the spotlight in Sweden to men. So we know that historically, when people talk about prostitution, it's usually a conversation exclusively about primarily women who are bought and sold in the sex trade. And the men who are buying, they're often not even part of the conversation. But in Sweden, they shifted it, and that's a consequence of, I would say patriarchy and racist social structures. But in Sweden, they started to shift the conversation and focus on male demand for prostitution. They began to recognize that this demand is the major contributing factor to the commercial sex trade's existence, as well as its growth. Sweden made a political commitment to end prostitution by, quote, convincing people to abstain from committing the crime of buying sex and to establish norms under which no woman, man, girl, or boy can be sold, and no one has the right to sexually exploit another human being, end quote. This moment right here is what makes the equality model so unique from the other models that we've discussed so far. To call prostitution gender and sex-based violence is very different than calling prostitution labor or sex work. And this leads to very different types of legislation and social interventions. Next slide. The regulation of prostitution varies according to each nation's underlying economic and social justice commitments. Whereas full decriminalization and legalization work in tandem with the political economic framework of neoliberalism, the equality model developed in a social democracy. The argument that prostitution is simply another form of labor and should be incorporated into the labor market as sex work is underpinned by the economic theory of neoliberalism, which, quote, seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market, end quote. From the neoliberal perspective, everything has the potential to be sold in a market, and the interests of individual laborers are advanced by market laws. Advocates of legalizing or fully decriminalizing prostitution assert that prostitution, normalized like any other marketable human interaction as work, will advance the well-being and individual interests of people in the sex trade. In contrast, social democratic theory asserts that countries must remove structural barriers to economic, social, and political inclusion in order to facilitate equity for women and other marginalized social groups. In social democracies, social policies, like I talked about earlier, generous parental leave, universal childcare, policies to eradicate poverty. In social democracies, these social policies, rather than the marketplace, are used to advance egalitarianism. In the Swedish social democracy, the sex trade, which everyone knows thrives off of the social inequality between women and men, white people and people of color, wealthy nations and colonized nations, is seen as an unacceptable practice rather than a market opportunity. The Swedish social democracy uses social policy initiatives, not market incentives, to further the societal well-being of all citizens. Next slide, please. The Swedish law has had many accomplishments. One of the primary intentions of the legislation was to change social norms that enabled and encouraged men to buy sexual access to others. A 2014 study found that after introduction of the legislation in 1999, criminalized sex buying, the number of men purchasing sex dropped in the country of Sweden from 13.6% to 7.4%. Opinion polls indicate that 70% of Swedes now support the law, which was a dramatic increase because before the law was introduced, the number of individuals supporting the law, I think it was maybe 13%. It was a very low number. So this shift toward a majority supporting the law may be indicative of the law's success in shaping social norms and social understanding about this particular social issue. According to Sweden's National Reporter on Human Trafficking, Sweden has become an unattractive destination country for traffickers, pimps, and sex buyers. In a comparison between Sweden and the Netherlands, it's estimated that in the entire country of Sweden, with a population of around 9.6 million, there are 400 to 600 individuals trafficked each year. In contrast, conservative estimates indicate that in just the city of Amsterdam alone, with a population of around 800,000, there are 4,000 individuals trafficked each year. So the number of individuals trafficked in just the city of Amsterdam is significantly higher than the number trafficked in Sweden, despite the fact that Sweden's total population is much higher than that of the city of Amsterdam. The next comparison I want to provide to you is a comparison between Denmark and Sweden. These are two demographically and geographically similar countries. Remember, in Sweden, there's around 9.6 million citizens. Denmark is a smaller country. There are approximately 5.6 million. So Denmark is significantly smaller, actually, in population size than Sweden. In 1999, Denmark implemented full decriminalization. That was the same year that Sweden enacted the equality model. Remember how we saw that in Sweden, after the equality model was enacted, a Swedish special inquiry found that the prostitution in Sweden had dropped by 40%, with approximately 400 to 600 individuals trafficked each year. Whereas in contrast, in the smaller country of Denmark, it's estimated that approximately 2,500 individuals are trafficked every year. I'll turn it over to Taina.
So of all the countries that have followed Sweden, and they bear repeating, so as you may have read in the prior slide, since 1999, and Sweden, interesting tidbit, for 10 years, Sweden was by itself with what was known then as the Swedish model. And they like to say that they were made fun of in official conferences or regional representation, whether it was the European Union or other bodies, to say, ha, 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 look at Sweden, how naive they are. They believe that prostitution is a form of violence and want to abolish it. And today, Iceland, Norway, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, France, Canada, Israel, and other countries are debating whether or not they should follow again Sweden's vision for gender equality and an end to gender-based violence and discrimination. Now, what makes France unique among these countries is that all of the other countries mentioned, reformed, amended their criminal provision. What France has done in 2016, when it had enacted the equality model, is that it amended at least 9 different codes. So I won't list them all, but they include administrative, criminal, educational, immigration, health, social services. So it does have the basic pillars of the equality model legal framework, in that it decriminalizes all prostituted person, it protects prostituted persons, offers them services, but not just to French citizens, but to undocumented foreigners as well. It provides access to exit programs, it prohibits the purchase of sexual acts by fining them. So in the first time that a sex buyer is caught, he has to pay approximately $1,500 which then increases, doubles. And then in certain circumstances, for instance, if they purchased a minor, then the sex buyer can be at risk of facing prosecution that leads to jail time. But right now, there's not one sex buyer that we know of around the world who is serving time in jail for the purchase of sexual acts. But more importantly, France is investing in national prevention programs. It's allocated the services, whether it's educational or immigration or other services, per department, which is their departments are sort of their states. And so they have mandatory meetings every quarter where each of the representatives from each of these different agencies come and meet and discuss the trafficking victims, people in prostitution who need assistance, and how to educate their communities on the harms of prostitution. Next slides, please. So what is the impact of the law? Again, this is a relatively new law. It's less than 10 years old. So far, there have been over 700 exit programs. 87% of formerly prostituted people are currently employed. 8,000 sex buyers have been penalized. 100% of them were men. 60% were partnered, married, or deemed quote unquote family men. There was a significant increase in successful prosecutions of pimps and traffickers, and this is a percentage that we also see in Sweden, where because the people in prostitution do not fear being criminalized and are offered services, they are a lot more at ease and feel a lot safer to give information about their traffickers or about the brothel managers who have them under their thumb. More importantly, they're to date, and this again, this is not an updated number, this is a 2022 number, that 2.35 million euros have been collected from sex buyers as fines, and they've been reinvested in programs for victims of sex trafficking and prostitution. And as in Sweden, prior to the Swedish law of 1999, around 80% of the Swedish population believed that it was perfectly acceptable for men to purchase sexual acts. Today, that percentages has reversed, where up to 80% of the Swedish population believe that not only is it unacceptable for men to have sexual access to women's bodies for sexual acts, women and others, but that it is also a barrier to gender equality. I've spoken to a number of Swedish men who said they would prefer being apprehended for driving under the influence than being caught purchasing sexual acts. And similarly in France right now, 78% of the French population approve of the law. The percentages vary. 81% of the women is a higher percentage than the men surveyed, but what is very promising is that the youth population between 18 and 24 years old approve of the law at 84%. Next slide, please. So the impact of the legal frameworks, Anne mentioned a lot of sort of the social impacts, and Mitha talked a lot about the medical impacts. It's very clear we're talking about simple economics. The equations of the sex trade are the same equations that any business would use of profit, of the incentive for profits that stems from the demand, and the more demand, the higher the supply. And so if you look at the number of prostituted people per thousand inhabitants in Germany, 3.61 versus the Netherlands, versus France at 0.55, for instance, and the Netherlands at 1.4 versus Sweden at 0.10. Next slide, please. So last year, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women issued a report on sex buyers in New York State, because again, they are the fuel of the sex trade. Without the market for the purchase of sexual acts, there would be no sex trade, and therefore there would be no sex trafficking. And because in New York State, where we hope that the state will one day enact the equality model, we find it extremely difficult for our policymakers and our legislators to understand, and our district attorneys, offices, and other prosecutors to understand the harm that sex buyers impart on the people they purchase, and exactly who they are. We call them the invisible men, but in fact, they are not invisible. And thank you for dropping the link to the sex buyers report in the chat. Again, globally, it's estimated that 99% of sex buyers are men. I always say that if a Martian came down and knew nothing about the sex trade, but if you showed it a cartoon, on the one side of the cartoon, there would be globally 99.9% men, and on the other side, there would be globally 96 or to 98% of women and girls, the remaining being trans and gender nonconforming people, men and boys. And the Martian would immediately understand that we are talking about a situation of sex inequality, of gender inequality, and would probably want to know how to fix this. So the percentage of men who reported having paid for sexual acts vary from country to country. In the United States, it's 16%. It could be anywhere between 10 and 20%. There is, the studies have not been fully developed, but there is a direct link, anecdotally and according to some individual studies, between sexual harassment of the general population, sexual violence, domestic violence, and sex buying. Can we have the next? Oh, and then before we go to the next one, one aspect that is never discussed is sort of the money spent on prostitution worldwide. So according to Havascope, it's 186 billion worldwide. The International Labor Organization has very, very conservative estimates, and these are numbers from 2014, and they're conservative for reasons that I won't go into now, but estimates that $99 billion of profits come from sex trafficking. So again, extremely narrow. That number is probably triple. But what no one says, not UN agencies or research institutes or health agencies, is that every single one of those dollars come from sex buyers. So when you see these billions and billions of profits from the sex trade, it is all because of sex buyers. Next slide, please. And the other element that is not discussed enough, and certainly not discussed here in this country, although France and Sweden have begun formally documenting, and Germany as well, are the economic implications of the sex trade, the social and economic costs of the system of prostitution, both at all levels of society, whether we are talking about social support or housing or the cost of the emergency room services, and all the indirect costs as well, not just to the state, but also to society, the tax evasion, the direct and indirect medical costs, and social costs. So I think for New York, it would be a very interesting study to know exactly how much does the system of prostitution cost the state, and not in a productive way. quite the opposite. Next slide, please, which I believe is Anne's.
Thank you. So this concludes the third section about the equality model. We again recognize that there was a lot of information provided to you, so we wanted to ensure that you understood some of the key takeaways from this portion of the presentation. We want folks to walk away understanding that the sex trade creates extensive harms to people who are bought in the sex trade. We discussed the medical, psychological harms, violence and abuse that's inherent. And then there are also significant harms to society, some of which you just heard Taina talking about, the economic implications. It also has an impact on how boys and young men are socialized and how young girls, women, members of the LGBTQ community are socialized. The equality model is based on human rights principles and international law. You heard Taina discuss this extensively. We hope that there will be at some point in New York State a commitment to increased collection of data so that we can understand the impact of the sex trade more fully, how its impact, not only on a state or country's economy, but on public health, as well as our ability to achieve some semblance of gender equality. I'm also going to announce the CLE code, again, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit. The certificate form that you need is in the chat. We can drop that in the chat again if there's anyone that hasn't received it, or you can just scroll up and you should find it earlier on. Okay, so we see it just was dropped in the chat again. So that code is 34 ERSW. Again, 34 ERSW, and the letters are all caps. I also wanted to take a moment to thank Proskauer for co-hosting this presentation and for facilitating the CLE credits. We have a lot of gratitude for the work that Proskauer does. Proskauer has taken a very active role in helping to address the issue of sex trafficking and supporting the work of nonprofits like Sanctuary for Families, as well as the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. So thank you, Proskauer, for that. And now we will advance. We have a few remaining slides. We're going to focus on New York State briefly, and then we will turn to the Q&A. Thank you.
So as mentioned, the Sex Trade Survivors Justice and Equality Act is a bill that is currently in the New York legislature. The co-sponsors are New York State Senator Liz Krueger and Assembly Member Pamela Hunter. It is a reflection of the equality model legal framework and is a five-pronged legal approach that would repeal the law calling for the arrest and incarceration of people in prostitution, which is Section 230, the repeal of that prostitution provision. It would offer comprehensive trauma-informed social services, including exit strategies should people wish to leave the sex trade. It will maintain the penalties for patronizing, also known as sex buying. It will continue to criminalize third-party exploiters. And it is committed to, again, like France and Sweden and other countries that have enacted the equality model, to engage in a robust community education campaign to raise awareness about the harms of the system of prostitution, and to link it to other forms of gender-based violence and discrimination, similar to what was done 40, 50 years ago on the crimes of domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment. And to the next slide, please, Samantha.
Sorry, I was just trying to find the unmute button. So New Yorkers for the Equality Model, we are a coalition. We're a survivor-led alliance made up of more than 30 advocates, prostitution and sex trafficking survivors, and organizational partners seeking to implement the Sex Trade Survivors Justice and Equality Act I mentioned, which in short we refer to as the Equality Model, with the aim of decriminalizing only individuals in prostitution in New York State. So we have a wonderful social media platform, which we regularly update our Instagram, where we post frequently. We offer lots of useful bite-sized resources on the issue, and generally it's a great way to keep up to date with us and the work that we're doing. So I have 2 QR codes here on the screen, one to our Instagram page, and then the other one as well will take you to our website. It takes you to our Join Our Movement page, where you can sign our statement of support for the bill. There's one for individuals and one for organizations to sign on. So if you are an organization within New York State who are interested in being part of this work, then, please do reach out to us to discuss further. And for any individuals who also join the movement, it also means that you will receive regular monthly newsletters. And in these newsletters, we post relevant news, upcoming events that we're hosting as well. So feel free to scan the 2 QR codes if you would like to be involved. And we'll also drop the links in the chat for ease of use as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to everyone for attending. We really appreciate your participation in this training. We appreciate your time, your attention, your commitment to this work and this issue. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, not very many, but we will go through and answer those. I'm going to start. There's a question asking if there's any advice for social workers and how we could address these issues working one-on-one with clients. I'm going to actually drop in the chat. We have a training that's happening tomorrow. That training will be recorded. So if folks are not unable to attend, we can get that recording to you. But we highly recommend that if you are a social worker, if you have a similar question, that you attend this training. Mitha, myself, and our colleague Gigi Prieto will be facilitating that training. And that training has much more of a clinical focus. It'll look at the dynamics of trauma bonding, indicators of CSE, safety planning, how to recognize the stages of change when a person is in the sex trade and they're in the process of exiting, and how to support them through those stages of change. There are a number of other things that will be covered in that particular training. So highly recommend that you attend that. And I will go ahead and drop the registration link in the chat.
I see there's a question about legislation 257 in California. I am assuming it has to do with the loitering, the repeal of loitering, although I'm certainly not an expert in local California law. Just from the articles that I've been reading on the issue, the problem from where we stand is not the repeal of loitering. New York has successfully repealed loitering. For those of you who don't know what the loitering provisions are, it was anyone who would be perceived by the police as someone who was soliciting prostitution could be arrested. And so the discriminatory impact of that was significant. In New York, they dubbed it the walking while trans law, which was repealed, and it was a law that we supported. And I'll speak for New York. It's not the issue of decriminalizing loitering, or even again, I'm not familiar exactly with the full extent of the law in California, but unless law enforcement and prosecutors have an understanding of the role and harm that sex buyers impart on the people they purchase, and sort of how they are key to the growth of the sex trade, then if we repeal only one part of this law and the sex buyers are not targeted then the message to the pimps and traffickers is that no one is getting apprehended, no one is getting arrested. Again, we support the decriminalization of the people in prostitution, including those who loiter. But what we are having here, the situation here in New York City, is because there is absolutely no political will, or if there is political will, it's too minimal for us to see it. If there's no political will to maintain the laws that prohibit patronizing, then the message again to exploiters is that business is open. We have actually read a number of online posts from pimps and traffickers saying, come to New York City, business is open, no one is getting arrested. And so I am assuming that that is what is happening in California as well, where yes, it is absolutely necessary, and we will applaud the fact that the people who are loitering are no longer arrested, but that does not also mean that law enforcement should give the green light to sex buyers. And then there was another question about equality model efforts in Africa. Well, Africa has about 6 dozen countries, so we are currently working with, this is the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, with partners are working both in Nigeria and in South Africa. A few weeks ago, or actually in December, unfortunately, the Ministry of Justice in South Africa presented a bill that would fully decriminalize the sex trade. And so there is a survivor-led movement that is trying to not only stop that bill from being, from moving forward and being enacted, but at the same time is promoting the equality model. They are calling it the Sankara model. For those of you who don't know Thomas Sankara, he is a former president of Burkina Faso and known as a revolutionary who spoke extensively about prostitution as being violence against women and as being a system that keeps women in second-class citizenship and must be abolished. And so our partners, both in Nigeria, which is another country in which we are working, and South Africa, are calling it the Sankara equality model.
I would like folks to know that we are going to add this recording to our website. So you will see in coming weeks, this recording will become available on the New Yorkers for the Equality Model website. We've dropped a few links to the that website in the chat, so feel free to look for it there. You can also Google New Yorkers for the Equality Model and it will come up. We can also re-drop it in the chat if folks are having difficulty locating it. I believe that concludes all of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So unless Mitha or Taina, you're seeing something that I don't, I'd like to say thanks to everyone. You have an extra 22 minutes in your day. I hope you enjoy those 22 minutes. We really, again, appreciate your time, your attention, your willingness to come listen to what is a very difficult, contentious topic, to engage with the material. We look forward to hearing from you. You will receive an email from us, which will include a number of articles referenced during this presentation. And know if folks are having difficulty accessing the certificate, please drop in the Q&A your email address or email me. My email address is in the chat. Probably better actually if you just email me directly and I can send you that certificate directly. Also, if you complete the certificate form, send it to me and we will get those CLE credits processed for you. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.